Always love getting educated here on Off the Podium, and I have just read a book that has educated me more than I think a lot of books have in my entire adult life. The book is called When Women Stood, The Untold History of Females Who Changed Sports and the World. And for our viewers right now on YouTube, I'm going to hold that up right now as a bit of advertising. And joining us now to talk about this book is a woman who wrote this book. She's written many books, has a very esteemed career, and has also a great career as well, which I'm very excited to talk about. A history maker, as one of the very first women in history to make the US women's bobsled team. There's so much here to talk about and learn about. Pleasure to welcome to the show, Alexandra Allred. Alex, first of all, welcome to Off the Podium.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm excited. I said when we first met, I laughed when I was reading some of your promo stuff. So you guys are awesome.
Well, that's the goal has been over 7 years, Alex, is to make someone laugh. So thank you for being the first. That's a big honor for us to finally have here on today. In all honesty, so much education came out of this book because the fight for equality when it comes to so many people out there in everyday life, let alone obviously sport, still to this day we're fighting for. But the history around women's fights in the sporting realms is absolutely incredible. I love the story that you've told about how you came up with writing this book because it is so closely connected with your amazing bobsled career.
I realize, and thank you for that, because I realize when you're in the middle of the fight, whatever the fight is, you don't have a lot of time except for just the fight. And then when I began teaching kinesiology, I was getting really annoyed because I would have the text that the university gave, and I'm teaching off of it. And in a 300-page book, there's like 3 or 4 pages about women, and that's it. And I started to argue with the dean of the college because I was saying, if I'm tasked with teaching tomorrow's occupational and physical therapists, trainers, coaches, you name it, how are they going to be helpful to anybody if they've only had 3 or 4 pages about women? And so that kind of started it. And I started teaching more about my own background to some of these students just to give perspective. And then it really was when I realized how many students would come up to me later and just say, I Googled you. It happened. And I'm like, yes. So for your listeners here, I was sitting on the couch watching ESPN and I saw bobsledding and I thought, man, this is the coolest sport I've ever seen. So I wait for the women, and the women never come. And I tell my college students, so yes, I got in my car and I went to the library because there was no such thing as
I remember
the
those.
Internet. And and I always see a lot of them. I'll see my students going, "What'd she say? The what?" And so but I found out that in 1940 there was a woman. There were a few women who bobsledded, but it was Captain Dewey, the granddaughter of Dewey Decimal System, Melville Dewey, and she won. She won in a 4-man bob, and she was the driver, and the only woman ever then and since who's ever won in an open competition with men. It took about 2 days for them to realize they didn't like that. They stripped her of her medal and banned women from the sport. So in 1994, when I won the U.S. women's bobsled team national, I won for the nationals. I became technically the first U.S. female bobsled champion.
Wow!
I'm really the second, but I became, officially the first. But I'm really the second. And I thought when that happened, okay, now it's going to get a little bit better. We were in Switzerland. I mean, in World Cup in Switzerland. We didn't have a coach. We didn't have anybody helping us. Since Albert of Monaco, his bodyguards came over and helped the women's U.S. team.
Wow.
And when we were in Canada, it was the Jamaican and Trinidad men's bobsled teams who came over and helped us.
Crazy.
And then when we finally got sponsorship, our men's B team tried to steal a lot of our equipment.
Wow.
Right? This was 1995, 96 by this time.
Jeez, that's absolutely crazy to think kind of that. And I mean, just even the stories there of the Jamaicans and the Trinidad teams. I mean, that was about the year that Cool Runnings came out. So, I mean, this story has been told of adversity for them to overcome to get into a sled. And yet they're still, females in the sport can't even basically get access to simple equipment, and then it's getting stolen away from them.
Well, and that's one of the reasons they help, because in fact, my favorite I always get asked, so you knew the Jamaican bobsled team? And I'll say, yeah, Dudley Stokes of Cool Runnings. And I tell, we were never, because didn't have coaches, we were never taught how to crash. And you have to learn how to be in the middle of a crash when you're going down a mountain at miles an hour on what feels like cement. And we didn't know. And so I remember when we finally came to a stop and I just collapsed backwards. I just felt like I'd been beaten to death by baseball bats. And I hear, and it's the spikes on the ice shoes. And the first face I see is Dudley Stokes. Because he had talked to me right before I went down. And he looks over and he goes, "Hey, Mama, you okay, Mama?" And I was like, "No, Mom, it's not okay." Just right out of the movie. But
didn't bring out an egg at that point, Did he?
No.
No, kiss my lucky ear. Like, that's absolutely crazy to think that, because I heard in one of the interviews that you talked about sort of in one of your students around Latino aspects in sport and kind of representation, and you mentioned that even as soon as the 90s, basically they were sort of struggling for representation in sport. And then I look at that, what you're talking about now with sort of your fight and women's fight for that. And then even moving forward, that we're still seeing that. Things like ski jumping, obviously you talk about that in the book. That wasn't only until 2014 in the Olympics. We've even seen recently, as Tokyo, things like stand-up canoeing was only included for women. So there's still this fight that you think that we've moved past this, that you think that this is something that was 50, 100 years ago, but it's still in the last 10, 20, 30 years that women are still fighting for their inclusion in certain sports in the Olympics.
Yeah, it's, my own students here I'm in Texas, and, and I'll teach. Women still are not, we're the only Western nation in the world whose constitution does not provide equal provisions for females.
That blew me away when I read that, Alex. When I read that in the book, I'm like, wow, how is that the US of all countries that is right. The thing?
And my students will argue, yeah, we are. Yeah, and I'll say, no, you're not. And we'll go round and round until I take them through it word by word, and then they realize that, yeah, it still has not been ratified. We still not made those provisions.
It's crazy. It is absolutely insane to think that. And one of the most fascinating things, actually, that I learned in the book was around about 100 years ago that Alice Milliat basically created a women's Olympics. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about this, because this is something that be honest with you, I was completely unfamiliar with.
Yes, and she did it because at the time, if you remember when the Olympics first started up, we were still expecting women to wear, it's an average of about 30 pounds of clothing. Mm. And so so that was, women were to wear long skirts, and they really only showed their hands and the top part of their neck and their faces. And so how can you be an athlete? And so when I talk to my classes, I always say, it's really easy to believe that women couldn't do these things, because when would you have ever seen them do it? So when women started to fight to get into some sports, and women were allowed to get into what was considered the leisure sports, like tennis, and so all the tennis players were out there going, leisure? Which version are you watching? but those were considered some of the leisure sports. And so upper class women were allowed to play those sports. So the Olympics began, and so they kind of allowed women in golf and tennis to get in. But right off the bat, it was very clear that women were not wanted in the games, that this was supposed to be going back to ancient Greece, and then this was about men's progress. So enough was enough. And finally, this French woman who was, she loved rowing. I mean, she was many other things, but she just decided this is unacceptable. And so when she realized that there was no negotiating with the IOC, she literally started up a women's Olympics. And the one argument they had, the two arguments were women physically couldn't handle the sports that they wanted to partake in, but also there wouldn't be interest. And by the way, that's a stereotype that holds today, is people will say, well, women's sports aren't as interesting. And I always point out, well, did you know that the most viewed sports in the Olympic Games are predominantly women's sports? Now, they're arguably different reasons, but those are the top sports, women's sports. Women are So much fun to watch, but that's just a stereotype. So what the IOC saw very quickly was the women's Olympics was massively successful. They had more countries at one point in the women's Olympics than they had in the IOC. And finally, the IOC finally had to say, for economic reasons, they had to legally shut it down, stop using our name. You can't use Olympics. And they tried to shut it down. And they essentially, in modern terms, they bought out the women's games and brought it into the IOC. And I just use that as a talking point in every class just to say, yeah, we have all these stereotypes that persist, but every time women get mad and go off and do their own thing, it winds up being so successful that the other group that was trying to shut them out are like, we were kidding.
Yeah.
We need you. Yeah.
Which it's also,
Jokes.
it's fascinating too to sort of learn those little bits which often don't get talked about through some of these historical figures who obviously, weren't too progressive or weren't too, I guess, forward when it came to their opinions on women and women's sports. I mean, you talk about Pierre de Coubertin in this book and sort of his thoughts around women in sports and the Olympics and those negotiations that happened around there. I mean, again, that's sort of often not something that gets talked about in the great legacy of Mr. de Coubertin, is it?
Yes. Well, and take Teddy Roosevelt.
Mm.
And so, the history behind both Roosevelts actually, but the history behind desperately needing the strong white male to represent all things. And so it was the 1904 St. Louis Games, and it was also coincided with the state fair. And so they had this idea, and they brought in indigenous people from around the world. And they had the indigenous people pair up against trained Olympians. And mind you, these indigenous people from around the world had no idea much less what the rules were of boxing, different track events, and they pitted them up. And so when the indigenous athlete, and they weren't athletes, just indigenous people who were there, when they put the indigenous people against the trained athletes, and they had no idea what the game was about or what the rules were and didn't do as well. This was written up in so many papers around the country of absolute proof of white power.
Mm.
And you just see why it was so important. And then, of course, one of the most popular female athletes of all time is Babe Dietrichson. And few know that she lobbied hard to get the first two ever Black female athletes on the U.S. track team kicked off. Well, one of them, Tide Pickett, was known to be the fastest girl in America.
Mm.
So why do you think,
Yeah.
And so there's so many backstories that we just don't even know about, mostly because we never really talk about women's history. And so as I dove into it, I went down a lot of rabbit holes because I was stunned at how many things I learned.
I was going to ask that in terms of the rabbit holes that I could imagine this takes you in, because I can imagine in a project like this, you obviously will start at point A, you'll start following a certain path, but then you'll go down rabbit hole A, B, C, D, and then before you know it, you've maybe added like an extra 5 chapters because you're touching on subjects that maybe initially you didn't think were going to be discussed in the book.
So when I was done, I had over 700 pages.
Wow.
Of research. And I knew it was too long, but I just kept going because there's so much about indigenous women. There's so much about Alaskan indigenous, and around the world. And so I really had to just bring it to the United States, North America, just to kind of bring it in. And you read the book, so I went out a lot, but I mostly brought it in for that reason alone. But because I was going to be teaching, U.S. students, but in the end, I had to edit down 700 plus, like 750 pages, down to 230.
Damn.
And I can tell you, I'm not a crier, but I actually shed tears over some of the women that I had to say goodbye to. I mean, it was
imagine.
hard.
Yeah. So you're saying there's the Allred cut, basically. You could like release this on Amazon, something that's sort of like the extended director's edition or something one day.
Yeah. Believe me, I saved a lot of my notes because there's women that I plan on revisiting again. But yeah, just so many rabbit holes because there was just so many crazy things that happened to just the indigenous alone.
Yeah, for sure. And another one that also really fascinated me, again, something that I wasn't overly familiar with too was sort of the notion around the medical studies around women and the fact that, as you talk a lot about in this book, pretty much so much of science and medicine is based around the average male, and yet there's not these sort of separate ones. And I think you talk about, is it the bikini line, essentially, that besides what's under a bikini, there's this assumption that women are exactly the same when it's not the truth. So, I mean, this was incredibly fascinating, everything that you were detailing around that and how that can help with athletes as well.
Because it's referred to as bikini medicine.
Mm.
And if a bikini covers it, then that might be a little different. And otherwise, to this day, the 154-pound, I don't know what that is in stones, but the 154-pound male is still used to represent women in medicine. And it wasn't until very recently that women were allowed in more clinical trials. We react different to anesthesias, sleeping aids, even alcohol, just over-the-counter medication. And so when we started realizing that women were having really adverse, dangerous, even fatal reactions, somebody finally said, "Oh, well, you think we should get them in their own." One of my favorite people who I interviewed in the book was Dr. Stacey Sims from New Zealand. And she was telling me that she did the Ironman. She went to Hawaii. She was going to do great. She was putting in phenomenal times. She goes to Hawaii and she just bombs. And she winds up in the medical tent. And she is bad. She's not well at all. And basically, the short of a very cool but long story is she's on the airplane flying back with mates from, around the UK. And all these women are like, "Oh, okay, well, are you about to start your period soon?" And she was like, "Yeah, and so she's thinking, as most female athletes have been told, and we do, is as long as we're not having that cycle in the competition, we should be okay. And Dr. Sims gets a lesson, an education on that flight, goes back to one of the premier researchers in kinesiology and exercise science and says, "Why do I have to find this out from other female athletes?" And he told her, he said, "Well, in research, women are a bit of an anomaly because of your hormones, and it's too time-consuming to include you guys in, so we don't." And that was one of my moments, too, is when I went back in and dove back into the medical stuff, because I was like, you have to understand this. And I really hammer it to my male students who are going to be in the field of kinesiology in some way, just to say, you got to understand this. You got to respect what's going on before you can help this person.
100%. I mean, you think, again, it's kind of one of these moments that we live in a day and age where we assume so much things are progressed past things like this, or that, we live in the modern world where these are things that we shouldn't be having to even discuss or face. But I mean, as you detail in the book, just some of this, again, obviously still happening, but again, that's more recent times that this is only where people like that are discovering that we still have issues in these fields.
Yeah, I did, and then this was several years ago, but the Mary Kane story, and for those who don't know, in the United States, she was dubbed the fastest girl in America. Mary Kane was a long-distance runner. She was on her way to the Olympic Games, and Nike calls her, and they want to bring her into the Nike project. And, if you're a young athlete just coming out of high school, are you kidding me? Yes. And so she went, and the mostly male coaching staff had no idea about the female triad, in terms of nutrition and all the things, why the biological female athlete needs different nutrition and needs different things. So they arbitrarily picked a weight that they thought that she should be, and literally starved her to death. She stopped getting her period, all kinds of negative issues, stress fractures, all caused by an unprofessional Nike staff. And she was nearly suicidal before she left the Nike project. They destroyed her career. And, I let my students know more female athletes than anybody will ever know had their careers destroyed, not on purpose, but by people who never taught that the biology of the female has special needs and needs different kind of training.
Because it's even the discussion around, you mentioned it there, something like a menstrual cycle, that it's still a taboo subject. A lot of people, mainly men, don't want to talk about it. And it's something that through studies, as you discuss in the book, it's a variety of different ways that women will react, athletes will react, kind of, as you were saying, in the lead up when they're on it, or I suppose even afterwards as well.
I am celebrating the fact that more female athletes now, you've seen there was I'm going blank on her name, but there was a golfer and a Chinese, I think a New Zealand golfer and a Chinese swimmer. And they did poorly in a golf tournament and at the Olympic Games. And both said to the reporter, yeah, well, I got my period, so I just didn't do as well. And then the reporter was just going, oh, can we take a break? They just didn't know how to react. And women celebrated that because it was so fun to hear somebody just say, this is what it is,
Yeah, because, it's a natural part of life, right, Alex? And it's sort of...
That's right. That's what I tell my students. I say, if you're going to be a coach, a trainer, a therapist, and you're afraid to have this conversation, please find another job.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's very, very good advice. It's so fascinating to go back to sort of the Women's Olympics, Alice Miller, and kind of as you discuss about how it happens and the amount of people that show up, show an interest to kind of showcase just that interest that is out there for women's sports. And it's kind of that cycle that we still find ourselves in, right? Whereas we see currently record attendances for so many different women's events. We've seen that in the UK with soccer. We had it here in Australia a couple of years ago with a cricket tournament. At the time of us recording this, the Women's World Cup is going to be in this country in just over a month's time. We're seeing record numbers of tickets being sold. But it's still always that level where it makes the news because people are like surprised, aren't they? Like, oh, look how many people showed up. Look how many. Do you think we're ever going to reach a day where it's just going to be like, 82,000 people showed up, a low number to a women's game? Like, why is this still so shocking that many people are showing up to these events?
Well, okay, so there's so many. Oh my gosh, you triggered me in so many ways.
Good, I like that. That's what we want to do here, Alex.
So we still live in a world in which there is a feminine ideal. For example, there's a reason why women's gymnastics and women's volleyball and women's ice skating are the most popular because they're petite and they're pretty and they show a lot of skin. Whereas the WNBA, men don't want to see large boned women. And I'm not saying that statement. I actually read that a sports commentator said those exact words. And so it's really hard to sell, as Brittany Griner said many, many years ago, it's hard to sell the sexy on the WNBA. And so it's just a lot easier for people. So soccer is always popular because there's still cute, smaller females with ponytails running around. That's, again, another description. So if it checks all the boxes, then it can be really, really popular, especially if little girls like it. So that's helpful in that one regard. But I think we're always going to have a problem just really letting ourselves delve into the idea that these women are phenomenal warriors on the field, right? I was talking to one of my students a long time ago, and I said, so here's my background. When I made the first ever U.S. women's bobsled team, and I was squatting 375, I was clocked at running just right at 20 miles an hour. I was an animal. I was also 4 months pregnant. And I always say, there's not a lot of, I don't see LeBron James puking his guts out 4 times a day, not being able to eat, being whacked out on hormones and still being able to bring an A game.
Yeah.
And so women are phenomenal anyway for all the things that we have to go through physically. And then when they get to the upper level, then they have to negotiate the media. And men don't have to do this, but women have to decide, what am I going to be?
Yeah.
Am I good? Am I going to be, on the tennis circuit, Anna Kournikova was called Anna Pornikova because hey, props to her because she walked off with so much more money than the best tennis players out there. So I'm not judging her for that, but that is the reality, is that female athletes have to decide what image they want to put out there to garner more attention and more sponsored endorsements.
And so that level, as you talk a lot about in the book, is sort of that male gaze and how we're still, I guess, fixated on that image, right? Whereas, the a lot of the female athletes are maybe perceived as being so much in the public eye because they're maybe selling themselves a little certain way to attract more sponsors in a way that the men don't have to do. You don't see LeBron James in the swimsuit edition of Sports Illustrated. I mean, I'd love to, LeBron, if you're listening, get in a bikini. I'm sure you'd look great, but it's not necessary. We don't talk about LeBron being the GOAT because he looks good in a bikini.
Right. But it is so important to sponsors of what the female athlete looks like. So we were on a World Cup tour. I can't remember what country. And one of the sponsors came and told all of us to be sure to have on lipstick.
Wow.
And you should have seen the crowd too, because if I'm being honest, there was about 30 women in there and 15 of us were gay, you know? And so to see, I said us, not that it matters, but I'm not gay, but it was funny to look around the room at the reaction of all these women who were like, what the did he just say? Are you sick? For one thing, we have on helmets.
Yeah.
But that was one of the first things, the advice we found out later on. So when this and talked to you guys, to the men, we were like, what did he say? He went and told them about the conditions of the track, you know, how the track was fast, that, you know, very different. President tells us to be sure we're wearing a lipstick. So, you know, until we can get past that kind of mindset on the mostly the male side of the sports world, and that's when I think things are going to improve. And they really are improving. You know, I am optimistic, but every now and then, I just at the rock, what was it, 2 years ago in Moscow at the rock climbing competition, and the angling of the camera to go up the crotches of female climbers was so overt, they actually cut the feed because it was that bad.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you just get that kind of stuff. And so it's easy to go down that rabbit hole.
Well, I was going to say, without trying to go down that path again, I mean, is it a case of, as we are seeing these shifts towards that in the future, that it obviously will be a gradual thing, but outside of, you know, moments like that, I know that we're obviously seeing a lot more women executives in sport, a lot more women coaches, a lot more, even in the media, a lot more women commentating sort of male predominant sports. I mean, I know here in Australia, you know, we're seeing that now, that basically all our very male heavy sports are often fronted by females now, to sort of get that, so that some young girl watching can see, well, that is a pathway for me, that it's a lot more accepted, and maybe we gradually just see that, so that again in 20, 30 years time, we're not having these conversations anymore. It is just part of our daily life that there's women's sports on one channel, there's women that like this that's sort of the change that is needed, that gradually it will hopefully occur.
It will, you know, and we're always going to have this conversation.
Yeah.
I do think that. I do think we're always going to have the conversation. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And I have a lot of students who are very feminine, and they love the traditional female sports, and they're not into, you know, the more extreme sports. And so, and I always tell them, I'm like, quit apologizing for that. You know, we want gymnasts, we want the cheerleaders, we want all those things, and we want you to want that. So I think we're always going to have a conversation. And like I said, I think that's fine. But for the athletes more extreme, you know, I hope that we'll stop having conversations about what she's wearing.
Yeah.
And really talk about what she can do. And we're going to get there. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic.
That's good. That's what we like, Alex.
Yeah.
Just touching on your bobsled career. I mean, it's fascinating sort of just reading that insight. And again, everything that you've discussed around that and all of that sort of stuff. But obviously 2002 happened. You mentioned Jill Bakken in the book. Obviously, she goes on to win that gold with Vanetta in Salt Lake. And it's also fascinating to think that was a 54-year drought that the US had at that point for a gold medal in the sport of bobsleigh, which, again, I'm always one for these droughts. I love it when a drought is broken in the Olympics and everything along those lines. But just what was that? How was that for you? I guess this is my question. Like, obviously, I'm sure you're thrilled. You've had this fight. You've got in the sport. But was there part of you that sort of was disappointed that you couldn't have been in the Olympics? Or maybe you could have? Like, what's the story around that? Like,
Oh, no, 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 not at all. In fact, and thank you for asking that, because I get asked that question a lot. So I got into it because when I went to the library that day, I couldn't believe that women weren't allowed in the Olympic Games. And so I began a very obnoxious letter writing campaign using the US postal system. And so I wrote letters. This isn't fair. This isn't right. And it just so happens. So I'm a 4th-degree black belt, and I used to be a competitive fighter at the time. And so I'm thinking, what? Tell me that I'll come over there and kick their ass. And so I'm writing all these letters to the USOC, the IOC. And one day I get a phone call, and I have a 6-month-old baby. And I get a phone call that says, okay, we're going to have our first ever U.S. women's trials. Are you coming, big mouth? And after you trash talk for that long, what are you going to say? Oh, it's just for you. And so I was like, yeah, I'll be there. And I remember hanging up the phone and thinking, I have no idea how to bobsled. And so, yeah. And so literally it was just, I crashed a lot, but every time I kept missing my baby at the time and kept thinking I need to get out of this, then somebody would say something and it would just piss me off. And so I thought I got in it just to make sure that others would get in it. And then we were going to go somewhere with it.
Fantastic.
And then it was in the spring, the early summer, that I realized I'm pregnant with baby number 2. And I had this moment of, shit. I mean, I was happy, but I was like, I can't drop out. Because if I dropped out, there'd be so many people who would say, yep, you see, you open something up and they all run off and get. And so I thought, I cannot tell anybody, and I can't quit. And so I wound up working with this top OBGYN researcher from Case Western. And I literally had the treatment because I was hooked up to everything to make sure that my baby was never in distress. And man, I was crushing it. Like I told you, I mean, I was just sprinting, plyometrics, heavy lifting. And then I went and I won. So here I am and I won. And this was such an amazing moment because not only did this happen, but my baby's with me, and my team, my newly named team is chanting that I cheated because I had 2, there were 2 of her pushing that. So, and so it's such a great moment. And I'm getting the gold medal put around my neck. And the then director of the U.S. Bobsled Federation leans over to me and he says, and this is with Sports Illustrated right there taking a picture, whispers, and he says, this means nothing, right? And I went back, and we all went back to the training center. Everybody met up in my room, and I told everybody what he said. And we, the 8 women, we made a pact, the first ever team, stay in as long as we can, except for an injury. Nobody drops out until we make the Olympic Games. And so that was for the next 4 years. I put up with more bullshit from men than I ever did in my whole life. And I did all sport. I mean, I was in martial arts in the 1980s, but this was such a horrible experience of the way we were treated by our own countrymen. And they were willing to let us crash and break bones so that we would pick up our things and go home. And so, and all of us collectively, we had unbelievable injuries that probably should have never happened. And bobsled is a really dangerous sport anyway, but we, except for a few, we all stayed in, and more came in, and we all stayed in. And I remember I got the phone call in 1998 for yet another season. And I was beat down, broken down, had 2 kids. And I got the phone call. They're going to announce that women have just made the 2002 Olympic Games. And I said, hell yes. And then I retired.
Wow. Jeez, you done what you needed to do at that point. You got it in.
Yeah, I made a pact that I would stay in until I knew the women were going to be in the games, and then I was out.
So you weren't tempted at all? You weren't tempted to carry on for another 4 years just with that prospect of an Olympic appearance?
I missed both of my daughters taking their first steps. I missed both of my daughters getting their first tooth. I missed a lot that I just couldn't get back. And during the dry season or off season, when you do land training, I would take my daughters with me pretty much everywhere we would go that I could bring them. But when I was competing and I was sliding overseas, I couldn't have them with me. And so I knew that I just missed too much. And I genuinely have no regrets because I a woman named Liz Persmedstat and I, we wrote the first ever U.S. women's bylaws for the bobsled program. And so like my fingerprints are on a lot of things. I'm real happy about that. But yeah, I just, after that, I didn't want to miss any more firsts for my kids.
So what was that moment then when Jill and Vanetta win that goal? Were you there in Salt Lake to witness that?
My sister and Liz Persmedstat were, and it was phenomenal because, and it's funny that you say Vanetta Flowers, everybody does, but the story behind that is Jill Bakken, who was the driver and won the gold. Jill Bakken was the only one to make it to 2002 from our original 8.
Wow.
Yeah, she was 18 when we had her on the team with us when she first started. And then she got to the 2002 games.
Fantastic. I love that. The original 8. There's a movie there. Like, I mean, again, screw Cool Runnings. I'm sorry, guys, but like, come on. This sounds like this is more entertaining. I want to see this movie.
Oh, you don't even know. In fact, it's funny you say that because I have been writing a screenplay for it. Talking to a couple of people because it's way funnier if you did Cool Runnings, but you made it like a league of their own.
Yes.
This was women's bobsled because one of our teammates was a 5-time world powerlifting champion.
Wow.
Who was squatting 625 pounds, and so she'd come up to the track and even the men were like, I want her as my break woman. Yeah, we just had amazing stories. Yeah.
Wow.
And the Canadian and British and German women, they were amazing for us because their federations helped us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I remember I was with Liz Persmedstat. We were in Germany, and I was kind of looking around at our competitions. And my background is fighting, and Liz is a shot putter, and the two of us, we can throw around a refrigerator pretty easily. And so I'm saying, man, we got this. We got this. We're gonna kick ass in this competition. And our elevator's about to take us up, and the elevator goes ding and kind of opens up, and Germany's number 1 team got on. And it was like the elevator even kind of went junk when they got on, and I giving head nods, being cool, and they got off the elevator, and the door shut again, and I looked at Liz and I go, "There's nothing wrong with second place." It's like that same day, and then the team that dominated for the longest time, the Swiss's number 1 team, and then Claudia and Susie, and they got on the elevator. And it was the same thing as they got off and we were like, bye. And I looked at Liz and she started shaking her head and I go, there's nothing wrong with third place.
Wow.
Were huge. Yeah.
And now you see it. It's only ever been the US, Canada, and Germany who've ever won the gold medals in the Olympics. Or in the case of Kaylee Humphries, you win it for both countries, right? So I guess that kind of works that way. Before I let you go, Alex, I believe you have a fun story around Australian bobsledders. I always like a good story around Australia and bobsledders because we've had many Australian bobsledders on the show over the years, so I'm intrigued to hear this.
So, well, for better context, we were talking before we started recording. We were talking about, Aussies will let fly with just about anything and let their feelings be known, and that's what triggered me. So we were we were in Calgary, World Cup in Calgary, and it's called the warming shed up the top of the mountain. That's where everybody hangs out before they go slide. And so we're all up there and it's way too packed. And so the Aussie team was huge. This is 1996. And these guys were gigantic, huge, probably as big as the Russians. And this one guy, and I don't know that he owned another word except for the F word. I mean, it was quite impressive. He used it as, it was an adverb, an adjective, a noun, a verb.
Very Australian. So, we're proud of that.
Yeah. And so, he was very colorful and lighting the place up. And finally somebody had complained, you can't move in here. And so finally he was like, all right, I'll clean this place out. He gets up on one of the benches and just farts the most toxic fart the world has ever known and cleared that place out after that.
Wow. Yep. Okay. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is Australia in a nutshell. I think, let's be honest, we've all done that here in this country. I think that's just...
I don't know, but yeah, people were running for their lives.
Wow, what an incredible story.
All fun, yeah. I never met any Australian women sliders at that time. There wasn't a team at that time. I don't even know when you got your first team of women. I should look that up.
I know we had them in 2010. I think 2006 was our first team off the top of my head. I know that recently it's sort of been a case where we've got a large portion who are sort of trying to get in there, and we just don't have the sleds really for them. And then obviously someone like Bree Walker, who's been doing fantastic things in the monobob, won multiple World Cups, finished sixth in the Olympics last year. So doing thoroughly good. But our sliding sports, I'll say, Alex, Jackie Narracott, silver for us in skeleton last year. So for a country that I don't even think we're within 1,000 kilometres of a sliding track, we were pretty proud to get an Olympic medal in a sliding sport last year.
Hey, listen, I was talking about Australian sliders not so long ago, because one of the things I was saying is I said, you can train your athletes can go places to train.
Yep.
The thing about bobsledding, so this is why it doesn't surprise me that Aussies are doing really well in the extreme sports, is bobsledding is, people don't realize what a dangerous and terrifying sport it can be. So you got to have a really edgy person ready to just fly.
Yep.
So yeah, Australia, no wonder you guys are killing it.
And there's some of our favorite athletes. We've had a bunch of them on the lead up to Beijing and afterwards as well, and always love to hear, because it is those stories. I think it's kind of like it's the journeys that any athlete has, particularly in a country, say, where winter sports aren't predominant, and as you're saying, these extreme sports, like how do you go from being one thing to another when they're so extreme? It's not like you're just, going from a sport with a ball to another ball. Like, these are completely different extremes, different climates, different everythings. And we love kind of hearing stories about that. The book, I'm going to try that again. When Women Stood, thank you, Ben, the untold history of females who changed sports and the world. You can buy it online right now, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all the places where good books are sold. Alex, it's such a pleasure to chat. And actually, before we let you go, if people want to stay up to date with what you've got going on, social media, websites, where can people stay up to date with everything you've got going on?
Yeah, you can always drop me a note. My website is www.alexandraallred. So there's 2 A's right there, alexandraallred.com. Yeah. And my on Amazon, and just check it out. I'd love it.
Beautiful. Can't recommend enough. Alex, appreciate your time on the show today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you are great. Thank you.